What would you do if you held a secret that could shatter a titan of industry, but revealing it would obliterate your own life? For Clara Hayes, a waitress drowning in debt at an exclusive Manhattan restaurant, this wasn't a hypothetical. She watched as legendary billionaire Arthur Vance, a man whose innovations had shaped the modern world, lifted a Mont Blanc pen worth more than her car. He was about to sign away his life's work for $3 billion. But Clara knew the truth. The deal was a meticulously crafted lie. She had only one chance to deliver a four-word warning that would either save him or destroy her. What happened next, no one saw coming. The air in the private dining room of Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive its name was only whispered among New York's elite, was thick with the scent of old money and new ambition. Mahogany walls absorbed the sound, creating a conspiratorial hush. Through the floor-to-ceiling window, the lights of Central Park twinkled like a carpet of fallen stars, a universe away from the galaxy of power brokers seated at the long, polished table. At the head of this table sat Arthur Vance. At 72, he looked every bit the Lion in winter. His mane of silver hair was a little thinner than in his prime, but his eyes, a piercing cobalt blue, had lost none of their legendary acuity. This was the man who had founded Vance Innovations in his garage and built it into a global tech behemoth. He had outmaneuvered competitors, predicted market shifts with uncanny accuracy, and become a Silicon Valley icon spoken of in the same breath as Jobs and Gates. But today he looked tired. The lines on his face seemed deeper, etched not just by age but by a profound weariness. Across from him, radiating a predatory energy that was the antithesis of Arthur's stoic presence, was Julian Croft. Barely 40, with a bespoke Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than a teacher's monthly salary, Julian was the smiling face of Apex Holdings, a notoriously aggressive private equity firm known for buying legacy companies and stripping them for parts. He was all brilliant white teeth and perfectly coiffed hair, his charm a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. Between them, spread across the table like a battle plan, was the document. Over 300 pages of dense legalese bound in dark blue leather. The culmination of 6 months of brutal negotiations, it was the agreement for Apex Holdings to acquire Vance Innovations for the staggering sum of $3.2 billion. For Julian, it was the deal of a lifetime. For Arthur, it was the end of an era. Serving them was Clara Hayes. To the men in this room, she was invisible, a functional part of the scenery, like the crystal water glasses or the silver cutlery. In her crisp black uniform, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, she moved with a quiet efficiency born of desperation. 6 months ago, Clara hadn't been serving canapes. She had been analyzing financial models as a junior analyst at a respected Wall Street firm. A rising star with a Wharton degree and a fierce work ethic. That firm had been Apex Holdings. Clara refilled Arthur Vance's water, her hands steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. She knew Julian Croft. She knew the reptilian coldness behind his charismatic smile. She had been the one on his team who had discovered a pattern, a predatory legal maneuver Apex used in their acquisitions. They would bury a seemingly innocuous clause deep within the ancillary documents. A clause that, when triggered post-acquisition, would claw back a significant portion of the sale price based on manufactured performance metrics. It was a brilliant, vicious, and borderline fraudulent strategy. When she had flagged it, citing ethical concerns, Julian had smiled that same white-toothed smile, thanked her for her diligence, and had her escorted from the building an hour later. Blacklisted, she found herself here, serving the very man she was once paid to help dismantle. She watched the performance at the table with a growing sense of dread. Arthur's lawyers, a team from the prestigious firm Cravath, Swain & Moore, looked pleased with themselves. They had secured a monumental payout for their client. Julian's team looked like wolves who had just cornered a stag. "Arthur, it's a testament to your life's work," Julian said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "We're not just buying a company, we're becoming custodians of a legacy. Your legacy." Arthur gave a non-committal grunt, his eyes scanning the signature page. His own CFO, a man named Mark Renshaw, who had been with him for 30 years, gave a slight, encouraging nod. Everything is in order, Arthur. It's a good deal. It's time. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. They had all missed it. Or worse, she thought, looking at Mark's slightly too eager face. Maybe someone had been paid to miss it. She remembered the clause number by heart. Addendum 11B, Section 4, the Legacy Performance Covenant. It looked like a standard earn-out provision, but its language was a viper's nest of legal traps designed to fail. It would allow Apex to claim Vance Innovations was underperforming within 6 months, triggering a massive penalty that would effectively slash the purchase price by nearly $1 billion. Arthur Vance would be robbed in slow motion, his legacy asset stripped, and his name tarnished. The Montblanc pen was uncapped. Its gold nib hovered over the paper, a millimeter away from finalizing the greatest corporate heist of the decade. Clara's mind raced. Say something, and Julian Croft would ruin her. He had the power to ensure she never worked in any professional capacity again. She'd be lucky to keep this job. She could be sued into oblivion, but if she stayed silent, she would be complicit in the fleecing of a great man, a pioneer. She would watch the corporate predator who had destroyed her career do the same to a man who represented everything she had once admired about the world of business. Her training, her instincts, her entire being screamed at her to remain invisible, but her conscience screamed louder. As Arthur Vance took a final breath, his hand steadying to sign his name, Clara moved. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a small, decisive act of rebellion. She stepped forward, ostensibly to clear a bread plate, placing herself directly in his line of sight. The world seemed to slow down. The low hum of the city outside faded into nothingness. The only sounds in Clara's ears were the frantic thumping of her own blood and the soft, terrible scratch the pen would soon make on the paper. Arthur Vance's eyes, clouded with a mix of resignation and nostalgia, were fixed on the dotted line. He was thinking of the early days, the all-nighters fueled by cheap coffee, the thrill of the first breakthrough, the faces of the employees who had become his family. This signature wasn't just ink. It was the final chapter of his life story. Julian Croft leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He raised his crystal glass in a silent, premature toast to his own reflection in the dark window. His lawyers shuffled their papers, ready to whisk the signed document away. The trap was set. The prey was ready. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her lungs, making it hard to breathe. She saw her future evaporating, the mountain of student debt she was already drowning in, the tiny apartment she could no longer afford, the shame of calling her parents to tell them she'd failed. Julian wouldn't just fire her, he'd make an example of her. He would paint her as a disgruntled, unstable ex-employee, a fantasist. No one would believe a waitress over a team of high-powered lawyers. But then she looked at Arthur Vance's face. She saw the quiet dignity there, the weight of a lifetime of work, and she saw the flicker of doubt he was trying so hard to conceal. He wasn't entirely sure, and that tiny crack of uncertainty was the only opening she had. She took one deliberate step closer to the head of the table, her movements smooth and practiced, her waitress mask firmly in place. She reached for an empty side plate next to Arthur's elbow. As her arm passed near his ear, she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. A ghost of a sound meant only for him. It was a risk so immense it felt like stepping off a cliff. "Don't sign that contract." 4 words. That was all. She didn't change her expression. She didn't pause. She picked up the plate and turned, her body moving on autopilot towards the service door, every muscle screaming at her to run. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the pen stopped. It froze, suspended a hair's breadth above the page. The silence in the room, which had been heavy and expectant, now became sharp and electric. Every eye snapped to Arthur Vance. He didn't look at Clara. His gaze remained fixed on the document, but something had changed. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sudden, intense spark of alarm. He slowly lifted the pen from the page and placed it carefully back in its velvet-lined box. Julian Croft's smile faltered. "Arthur, everything all right?" he asked, his voice still smooth, but now laced with a thread of impatience. Arthur didn't answer him. He slowly raised his head, and his cobalt eyes scanned the faces around the table. His own lawyers looked bewildered. His CFO, Mark Renshaw, had a flicker of panic in his eyes that he quickly masked with a look of polite concern. "Just a moment," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping past the service door, where Clara had just disappeared. He hadn't seen her face clearly, but he had heard the urgency, the quiet terror, and the unmistakable ring of sincerity in her whisper. It was a tone that cut through the practiced sycophancy he was so used to hearing. Julian's patience snapped. This was the moment of his triumph, and it was slipping away for no discernible reason. "Arthur, the board has approved. Your team has approved. It's a landmark deal. Let's not get cold feet at the finish line." He laughed, but it was a brittle, anxious sound. Arthur ignored him completely. He pushed his chair back, the heavy wood scraping softly against the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. He stood up, a towering figure even with his slight stoop. "I need some air," he announced, his voice resonating with an authority that had been absent moments before. He looked directly at his lead counsel. "Nobody touches this document. Nobody leaves this room. We're taking a recess." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the private dining room, leaving behind a stunned tableau of powerful men, their billion-dollar deal suddenly hanging by the thread of a waitress's four-word warning. Julian Croft's face was a mask of fury and confusion. He shot a venomous glare toward the service door, his mind already racing, trying to figure out what had just happened. Who was she? In the hallway, Arthur Vance didn't head for the exit. He walked straight to the restaurant's maître d'. "The waitress," Arthur said, his voice low and urgent. "The one who was just serving my private room. I need to speak with her. Now." The restaurant's wine cellar was a world away from the opulent dining room above. It was cool and quiet, smelling of damp earth, cork, and aging potential. Rows upon rows of priceless vintages stood silent witness in the dim light. It was here that the maître d', flustered by the billionaire's strange request, had led Arthur and a terrified Clara. Clara stood with her back against a rack of Chateau Margaux, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her server's apron felt like a costume, a flimsy disguise for the sheer terror she was feeling. She was alone with Arthur Vance, the man whose empire she had just thrown into chaos. He wasn't angry. That was the most unnerving part. He simply studied her, his blue eyes probing, analytical, like he was debugging a complex line of code. "You have 60 seconds, he began, his voice calm and even, betraying no emotion. "After that, I will assume you are either insane or working for a competitor, and I will hand you over to my security team, who are considerably less patient than I am. So tell me, young lady, why did you tell me not to sign that contract?" Clara's throat was dry. This was it, the moment of truth. She had to be precise, credible, and fast. "Addendum 11B, Section 4, she said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. "The Legacy Performance Covenant. It's designed to be impossible to meet." Arthur's eyebrows shot up. It was a subtle reaction, but to Clara it was a seismic shift. He hadn't expected a specific technical answer. He had expected a vague warning, a hunch. "Explain," he commanded. "It ties post-acquisition performance metrics to Q4 of last year," she rushed on, the words tumbling out as her analyst's brain took over. "Which was your company's best quarter in its 50-year history, boosted by a one-time government contract. The covenant requires a 15% growth on that impossible baseline, quarter over quarter, for a full year. It's not a performance metric, it's a pretext. When the company inevitably fails to meet it, Apex Holdings can trigger a penalty clause that reevaluates the company's worth and allows them to claw back up to 30% of the purchase price. Nearly $1 billion. She stopped, breathing heavily. She had laid her cards on the table. Arthur stared at her, his expression unreadable. He walked slowly down the narrow aisle, trailing his fingers over the dusty bottles. "My lawyers at Cravath, my CFO of 30 years, they all vetted this document. They are the best in the world. They saw nothing. Did they read the ancillary documents themselves, or did they allow Apex's legal team to provide summaries?" Clara challenged, her confidence growing as she stepped onto familiar ground. "It's a classic Apex tactic. They drown the other side in paperwork, thousands of pages of due diligence. then provide helpful summaries that conveniently misrepresent the most toxic clauses. The covenant is buried in the fine print of a document pertaining to employee pension transfers. No one would think to look for it there. A long silence stretched between them. Arthur stopped his pacing and turned to face her fully. "How do you know this? And who are you?" Clara took a deep breath. "My name is Clara Hayes. I graduated from Wharton 2 years ago. Until 6 months ago, I was a junior financial analyst at Apex Holdings. I worked for Julian Croft." The name hung in the air between them. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Now the pieces were clicking into place. "I was on the due diligence team for their acquisition of an aerospace company, Aerodyne. I found this exact strategy, this poison pill covenant, buried in their deal. I flagged it. I told Julian it was unethical and amounted to fraud. He told me it was aggressive value realization, and a condition of my employment was to embrace the company culture. I refused. He fired me the next day and made sure my name was poison on Wall Street. The only job I could get was this one." She gestured to her uniform, a wave of humiliation washing over her. "I watched the Aerodyne deal close. 6 months later, Apex clawed back $400 million. The company was gutted, and its founder was ruined." She looked him straight in the eye, her fear replaced by a defiant conviction. "Julian Croft is doing the same thing to you. He isn't buying your legacy. He is buying your name so he can destroy your company and feast on its bones. That contract isn't a sale, it's an execution warrant." Arthur Vance was a man who had built his fortune on his ability to read people, to separate genius from fraud, substance from hype. He had listened to thousands of pitches in his career. He knew the sound of truth, even when it was whispered in a wine cellar by a terrified waitress. What she described was not just plausible, it had the disgusting, intricate elegance of the kind of corporate villainy he had fought against his entire life. He thought of his CFO, Mark Renshaw, and his eagerness to get the deal done. He recalled Mark's recent purchase of a multi-million-dollar home in the Hamptons, something that seemed extravagant even on his generous salary. He thought of his lawyers, brilliant but overworked, perhaps too trusting of a rival firm's professional courtesy. He had been so tired, so ready to let go, that he had allowed himself to be blind. This young woman, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, had just opened his eyes. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the hum of the climate control. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, Ms. Hayes," he said, and the tone of his voice had changed. The interrogator was gone, replaced by the CEO. "Let's assume I believe you. I can't just walk back in there and call off the deal based on your word. Croft would sue me for breach of contract and he'd win. I need proof. Incontrovertible, undeniable proof. And I need it before morning." Clara's heart leaped. He believed her. "The original Aerodyne acquisition documents," she said immediately. "If you can get a copy, the wording of their covenant will be nearly identical to the one in your contract. It's his signature move. He's arrogant. He reuses his code." Arthur pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with a speed that defied his age. He dialed a number. "Robert, it's Arthur. I need you to wake up. I'm sending you an address." "Yes, it's urgent. I need you to bring your personal laptop, the encrypted one. And I need you to get me every single document related to the Apex Aerodyne acquisition of last year. Use any resource you have to. I don't care what it costs. I need it within the hour." He hung up. Robert Sterling was his personal lawyer, a semi-retired bulldog litigator who trusted no one and feared nothing. If anyone could get the files, it was him. Arthur looked back at Clara. "You're not a waitress anymore, Ms. Hayes. For the rest of the night, you work for me. Come on. We have a long night ahead of us." He led the way out of the wine cellar, a general marching back to war. Clara, her mind reeling and her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, followed him, leaving her apron and her old life behind on the cold, damp floor. Arthur didn't take Clara back to the tense standoff in the private dining room. Instead, he had the maitre d' discreetly show them to a small, unused office at the back of the restaurant, a cluttered space with a desk, a phone, and a single humming computer. He then sent a message to the waiting executives. Unexpected personal matter. The recess is extended until 9 a.m. tomorrow. Please reconvene here. The message was deliberately vague, designed to let Julian Croft's arrogance fester into overconfidence. Croft would assume Arthur was having a momentary wobble, an old man's sentimentality, not that his entire scheme was being unraveled 2 floors below. An hour later, Robert Sterling arrived. He was a short, rumpled man in his late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes behind thick glasses. He carried a battered leather briefcase and a heavy-duty laptop. He gave Clara a quick, appraising look, but didn't question her presence. He'd worked with Arthur long enough to know that when his friend did something unorthodox, there was always a very good reason. "This better be good, Arthur," Robert grumbled, setting up his laptop. "I was having a very nice dream about finally winning a case against the EPA." "This is better," Arthur said grimly. "Meet Clara Hayes. She's our new senior strategic advisor. Ms. Hayes, this is Robert Sterling, the only lawyer I trust not to bill me for his own breathing." Robert gave a curt nod as Arthur quickly summarized Clara's bombshell revelations. As he spoke, Robert's grumpy demeanor dissolved, replaced by the focused intensity of a predator catching a scent. He typed furiously, his fingers flying across the keyboard, accessing secure legal databases and back channels of information he'd cultivated over 40 years. "She's right about the paperwork," Robert muttered after a few minutes of searching. "Apex sent over 5,000 pages of supporting documentation. Our team at Cravath assigned it to a group of junior associates. They would have relied on the summaries provided by Apex. Standard practice, but lazy, dangerous with a shark like Croft." The next few hours were a masterclass in corporate espionage. Under Robert's guidance and Clara's direction, they dove into the digital labyrinth. Clara, freed from her waitress uniform and fueled by black coffee, was transformed. She pointed Robert to the exact sections, the specific legal jargon, the deliberate obfuscation she knew so well. "Look for phrases like post-performance value attestation and synergistic asset reconciliation," she instructed. "That's the language they use to hide the penalty triggers." At 2:15 a.m., Robert let out a low whistle. "Got it. The Aerodyne deal." He projected the document onto the office's blank wall, and there it was, in black and white, a covenant with language so similar to the one in Arthur's contract it was like a DNA match. The same impossible baseline, the same punitive clawback structure. It was a template, Julian Croft's signature weapon. "That's the smoking gun," Robert said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Using an identical predatory clause in 2 separate deals shows a pattern of deliberate intent to defraud. This isn't just grounds to terminate your deal, it's grounds for an SEC investigation." But Arthur wasn't satisfied. This was bigger than just killing the deal. He had been betrayed, not just by Croft, but potentially by someone on his own team. His eyes were cold with fury. "Mark Renshaw," Arthur said, the name dropping like a stone in the quiet room. "My CFO. He was too eager, too quick to dismiss my concerns over the last few weeks. Robert, I need to know if he's compromised." This required a deeper, more dangerous dive. Robert used a program that scanned for financial transactions, communications, anything linking Renshaw to Apex. For 2 hours, they found nothing. Mark was clean. Clara began to feel a pang of guilt. Had she wrongly maligned a loyal employee? Then she remembered something else about how Apex operated. "They don't bribe directly," she said, her voice quiet. "It's too traceable. They use proxies, third parties. They find a weakness, a debt, a vice." She paused. "Does Mr. Renshaw have any family members with financial troubles?" Arthur's face darkened. "His son, David, a failed startup founder with a nasty gambling problem. He's in deep." It was the final key. Robert Sterling changed his search parameters. He wasn't looking for a direct payment from Apex to Mark Renshaw. He was looking for a third-party entity settling the debts of David Renshaw. At 4:47 a.m., they found it. A shell corporation, registered in the Cayman Islands and known to be a financial vehicle for Apex Holdings, had deposited $2 million into an escrow account that had then been used to clear a series of massive gambling debts held by David Renshaw. The payment had been made 3 months ago, just as the final negotiations for the Vance Innovations deal were intensifying. Mark Renshaw hadn't been bribed. His son's future had been ransomed. He hadn't sold out his boss for greed, but for love and fear. It was a more tragic and more potent form of betrayal. The sun was beginning to cast a pale gray light over the city. The office was littered with empty coffee cups. Arthur Vance sat at the desk, no longer looking like a tired old man, but like a king who had just uncovered a plot against his throne. He now had the evidence: the poison pill clause, the pattern of fraud from the Aerodyne deal, and the quiet, heartbreaking betrayal of his most trusted friend. He looked at Clara, whose face was pale with exhaustion but whose eyes burned with a fierce light. In one night she had gone from a disgraced analyst to the architect of his salvation. "Robert," Arthur said, his voice dangerously calm, "get our copies of the contract. Make 3 photocopies of everything we found tonight. One for me, one for you, and one for the SEC." He then turned to Clara. "Ms. Hayes, go get some rest. I have a feeling tomorrow morning is going to be a very memorable day, and I'd like you to be there." "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, suddenly aware she had no uniform, no role. Arthur gave the faintest hint of a smile. "You're going to sit at the table with me, as my advisor." He paused. "And wear something nice. I'll have a car take you home and wait for you. The days of you wearing a waitress uniform are over." At precisely 9 a.m., the scene in the private dining room at Aurelia was one of barely concealed tension. Julian Croft and his team of lawyers were back, their faces a mixture of irritation and smug confidence. Julian had convinced himself that Arthur's recess was nothing more than a sentimental old man's final moment of hesitation before surrendering his kingdom. He had spent the night celebrating with his inner circle, boasting of his victory. Arthur's CFO, Mark Renshaw, and the Cravath lawyers were also present, looking nervous and sleep-deprived. Mark avoided looking anyone in the eye, his face pale and drawn. He kept glancing at the door, expecting Arthur to walk in, offer a sheepish apology, and sign the contract. The door opened. Arthur Vance entered, but he was not the same man who had left the night before. The weariness was gone, replaced by an icy calm. He moved with a renewed purpose, the lion not in winter, but in the heat of the hunt. And right behind him, to the astonishment of everyone in the room, was the waitress from the night before. Clara Hayes was no longer invisible. She was dressed in a simple but elegant dark blue business dress, which Arthur's driver had waited for her to retrieve from her modest apartment. Her hair was down, falling neatly around her shoulders. She carried a leather-bound folio and met Julian Croft's gaze with a look of cool defiance. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of recognition, then immediate contemptuous dismissal, crossed his face. He shot a look at Mark Renshaw, as if to say, "What is this?" "Good morning, gentlemen," Arthur said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Apologies for the delay. I had some due diligence of my own to attend to." He gestured to the chair beside him. "Please allow me to introduce my new senior strategic advisor, Ms. Clara Hayes. Some of you may remember her." Julian Croft let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Arthur, what is this circus? You're bringing your serving staff into a multi-billion-dollar negotiation?" Arthur ignored him, his eyes locking onto his CFO. "Mark, how is your son, David?" The question landed like a physical blow. All the color drained from Mark Renshaw's face. He began to stammer. He's fine, Arthur. What does he have to do with this?" "Everything," Arthur said, his voice flat and cold. He slid a piece of paper across the polished table. It was a bank statement from the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation. Mark stared at it, his hand trembling, his professional life finished. He slumped in his chair, a broken man. Arthur then turned his glacial gaze upon Julian Croft. "Julian, I've been reviewing our agreement, and I have to say, it's a work of art. Truly." Julian, though clearly rattled by the exchange with Mark, regained his composure. "It's the best deal you'll ever get, Arthur. A legacy-defining moment." "Oh, it's certainly defining," Arthur agreed. He opened a folio in front of him, a copy of the one Clara was holding. "Let's talk about Addendum 11B, Section 4. The Legacy Performance Covenant, an interesting piece of legal fiction. It requires my company to grow 15% quarter over quarter from a baseline you know is impossible to replicate. I imagine you have a name for this kind of strategy inside Apex. Julian's face became a stony mask, but a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. His lawyers began to whisper urgently to one another. Does the name Aerodyne ring a bell? Arthur continued, pressing his advantage. He slid another document across the table. It was a side-by-side comparison of the clause in his contract and the one from the Aerodyne deal. The wording was nearly identical. You see, I'm a man who believes in patterns, and this is a very clear pattern of predatory, fraudulent behavior. I believe the Securities and Exchange Commission will find it fascinating. My lawyer, Robert Sterling, is on his way to their offices as we speak. The room erupted. Julian's lawyers were on their feet, protesting loudly. This is an outrage. These are baseless accusations. Julian shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Clara. This is her. She's a disgruntled former employee we fired for incompetence. She's feeding you lies, Arthur. You're going to believe this. This nobody over your own team? Ms. Hayes was not fired for incompetence, Arthur said, his voice rising with controlled fury, silencing the room. She was fired for having integrity, a quality you wouldn't recognize. She was fired for trying to stop you from doing to Aerodyne what you just tried to do to me. He stood up, his full height seeming to diminish everyone else at the table. He took the 300-page contract, the product of months of work, and with a strength that surprised everyone, he ripped it in half. The sound of tearing paper was the only sound in the dead silent room. The deal, Arthur Vance announced, his voice booming with absolute authority, is off. Every document we have uncovered will be turned over to the authorities and to the financial press. I will spend the next chapter of my life making sure the name Julian Croft becomes synonymous with corporate fraud. Now get out of my sight. Julian and his legal team were stunned into silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief and panic. Their perfectly laid trap had not only failed, it had sprung back and caught them. Defeated and humiliated, they gathered their briefcases and scrambled out of the room, leaving the remnants of their billion-dollar heist scattered on the table. Arthur Vance stood amidst the ruin of the deal, not with triumph, but with a grim sense of justice. He looked at the torn contract, then at the two people who remained, a shattered, weeping Mark Renshaw, and the quiet, resolute young woman who had saved him. The room was no longer a gilded cage. It was a courtroom where judgment had just been rendered. The silence that descended after Julian Croft's humiliating exit was heavier than the one before. It was filled with the wreckage of a multi-billion-dollar deal and a 30-year friendship. Mark Renshaw sat with his head in his hands, his quiet sobs the only sound. The remaining lawyers from Cravath stood awkwardly, shuffling their feet, unsure of their role now that their client had just single-handedly detonated the biggest deal of their careers. They all looked at Arthur Vance, expecting him to turn his wrath on Mark, to call security, to complete the destruction. Arthur walked over to his old friend. He placed a hand on Mark's shaking shoulder. "Go home, Mark," he said, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a deep, profound sadness. "Go be with your son. We'll talk later, when the dust has settled." Mark looked up, his eyes full of shame and gratitude, and stumbled out of the room without another word. Now only Arthur, Clara, and the bewildered Cravath legal team remained. Arthur's lead counsel, a senior partner named Harrison, finally found his voice. "Mr. Vance, Arthur, what are your instructions? We need to do damage control. Apex will undoubtedly try to spin this." Arthur held up a hand, silencing him. He turned his full attention to Clara, who had been watching the entire exchange with a quiet intensity. The whole room, what was left of it, seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what he would do about the catalyst for this entire cataclysm. Would he give her a check? A quiet thank you? A recommendation for another job? This was the moment that would define the rest of her life. She had taken an impossible risk, and while she had succeeded in saving him, she was still, technically, an unemployed waitress who had just made an enemy of one of the most ruthless men on Wall Street. "Ms. Hayes," Arthur began, his tone formal again, "you have demonstrated more intelligence, courage, and integrity in the last 12 hours than I have seen in the last 12 years on Wall Street." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Then he made his move. It wasn't what anyone expected. "I came here yesterday to sell my company because I was tired," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound energy. "I thought its best days were behind it. I thought my work was done. I was wrong. The battle, it seems, is not over. It has just changed." He walked to the head of the table, sweeping the torn pieces of the contract into a wastebasket with a decisive clang. "Therefore, I am announcing today that Vance Innovations is no longer for sale, effective immediately." Harrison, the lawyer, sputtered. "Mr. Vance, the board, the shareholders. The board and the shareholders will be thrilled to learn that I just saved them from losing $1 billion in a fraudulent deal." Arthur cut him off sharply. "But we're not just going back to business as usual. We're going on the offensive." He turned back to Clara, and his next words were the ones that stunned the whole room into absolute silence. "I am creating a new independent division within Vance Innovations. The sole purpose of this division will be to proactively investigate and combat corporate fraud and unethical market manipulation. It will be funded with an initial endowment of $100 million, the money I would have spent on lawyers fighting Croft. It will be an ethics watchdog with real teeth, designed to protect companies from predators like Apex Holdings." He took a breath, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "And I want you, Clara Hayes, to run it. I'm not offering you a job as an analyst or an advisor. I am offering you the position of president of the new Vance Corporate Integrity Division. You will report directly to me. You will have your own budget, your own team, and the full backing of my company's resources to build this division from the ground up. You will hunt the hunters." The lawyers from Cravath stared, their mouths agape. They had just witnessed a billionaire, on the word of a waitress he'd met less than a day ago, not only scuttle a $3.2 billion deal, but create a new $100 million division on the spot and offer her the presidency of it. It was unprecedented. It was insane. It was brilliant. Clara was speechless. Her mind couldn't process the scale of what was happening. President? $100 million endowment? Just yesterday, her biggest financial concern was making rent. She felt a wave of dizziness. "Mr. Vance, I don't know what to say," she stammered. "I'm just an analyst. I'm not qualified." "You were qualified enough to see what a dozen lawyers and bankers missed," Arthur countered, his voice gentle but firm. "You were qualified enough to risk everything for what was right. That's more than a qualification. It's a prerequisite. I can hire people with experience. I can't hire courage. I can't hire character. I'm offering you a chance not just to have a career, but to have a mission. What do you say, Ms. Hayes?" Clara looked at the torn contract in the wastebasket, at the stunned faces of the powerful lawyers, and at the unwavering belief in Arthur Vance's eyes. This was more than a job offer. It was a validation of every choice she had ever made. It was justice. She stood up straighter, a smile finally breaking through her exhausted facade. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Mr. Vance, I accept." The 6 months that followed the showdown at Aurelia were a blur of seismic shifts, both in the gleaming towers of Wall Street and in the quiet, radically altered life of Clara Hayes. The story of the aborted acquisition became an instant legend, a modern-day David and Goliath tale whispered in boardrooms and trading floors. It was dubbed the Aurelia Takedown by a columnist in the Wall Street Journal, a name that stuck. The narrative was irresistible. The billionaire titan, the corporate wolf, and the invisible waitress who brought the whole charade crashing down with 4 whispered words. For Julian Croft and Apex Holdings, the aftermath was a slow, public execution. Arthur Vance was true to his word. He didn't just walk away from the deal, he declared war. The evidence Clara had helped uncover, the damning comparison to the Aerodyne deal, the proof of Mark Renshaw's coercion, was meticulously packaged by Robert Sterling and delivered not only to the SEC, but to key journalists at major financial publications. The ensuing investigation was swift and brutal. Apex's assets were frozen, their investors panicked, and a flood of lawsuits emerged from the woodwork as other companies, emboldened by Vance's stand, began re-examining their own deals with the predatory firm. Julian Croft's fall was spectacular, Stripped of his CEO title and facing federal indictment for securities fraud and conspiracy, he became a pariah. The final, humiliating image of his reign was a grainy news photo of him leaving his Park Avenue apartment in a rumpled suit, his face a mask of impotent fury, the brilliant white smile replaced by a permanent sneer as he pushed through a throng of reporters. The wolf had been caged. For Mark Renshaw, the path was quieter and more complex. Arthur, in an act of deep and sorrowful grace, refused to press charges. Instead, he funded Mark's legal defense on the condition that he cooperate fully with the authorities. Mark became the government's key witness, his testimony methodically detailing the mechanics of Apex's scheme. He lost his career, his reputation, and his fortune. But in doing so, he found a fragile path back to his family. Arthur occasionally received quiet emails from him, not about business, but about coaching his son's baseball team and the unexpected peace found in a life stripped of its gilded trappings. But the most profound transformation was that of Clara Hayes. Her first day as the president of the new Vance Corporate Integrity Division was the most terrifying day of her life. Arthur had given her a sprawling corner office on the 50th floor, the same floor as his own. It was a glass-walled palace with a view that stretched from the Statue of Liberty to the Bronx, a view she had only ever seen in movies. She walked in wearing a new, well-fitting pantsuit that had cost more than 2 months' rent at her old apartment, feeling like a child playing dress-up. The mahogany desk was the size of her former kitchen table. She was paralyzed by the sheer scale of it all, by the crushing weight of Arthur's faith in her. Imposter syndrome was not a gentle whisper, it was a deafening roar. The skepticism from the existing Vance Innovations executive team was palpable. They were polite, of course, Arthur's decree was absolute. But in their eyes, she saw their true assessment. She was a curiosity, a pet project, the billionaire's whimsical gamble. A senior vice president of operations, a grizzled corporate lifer named Caldwell, was particularly cool. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Hayes," he'd said in their first meeting, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let us know if you need the photocopier explained." Her first week was spent in that cavernous office, reading, studying, and fighting waves of panic. Arthur, sensing her struggle, came in at the end of the week and sat not behind the imposing desk, but in one of the simple chairs opposite her. "They think I'm a fluke," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I think they might be right. I'm an analyst, Arthur, not a president. I don't know how to build a division." Arthur looked at her, his gaze kind but firm. "I don't need you to be a president, Clara. I need you to be you. You're an analyst at your core. So analyze the problem. The problem is corporate predation. Your mission isn't to manage quarterly reports, it's to build a weapon. You know how the enemy thinks. You are on the inside. So build your division based on that knowledge. Hire people who think like you. Hire the ones who see the details others miss. Hire the ones who've been pushed out for having too much integrity. Forget the traditional org chart. Build a team of hunters." That conversation was the key. It unlocked everything. Clara stopped trying to be the executive she thought she was supposed to be and started being the leader she was. Her first hires were as unorthodox as her appointment. She found a forensic accountant, a woman named Maria, who had been let go from a Big Four accounting firm for being too disruptive, which meant she found fraud her bosses preferred to ignore. She recruited a cybersecurity expert, a young man who went by the handle Nix, whom she tracked down through back channels. He operated out of a basement apartment in Queens and saw network vulnerabilities as a form of poetry. Her legal counsel was a world-weary former SEC enforcement lawyer, Samuel, who had retired in disgust at the bureaucracy, but still burned with a desire to see justice done. They were a team of misfits, of outcasts, united by a shared disdain for the system's loopholes and the predators who exploited them. Caldwell and the other VPs watched the strange collection of people with amusement, waiting for the experiment to fail. The turning point came 2 months in. Clara, in a proactive move, decided to run a full diagnostic on Vance Innovations' own vulnerabilities, treating her own company as the CID's first client. Her team dove into the corporate structure, the supply chains, the digital infrastructure. Caldwell was openly hostile, viewing it as an invasive audit and slow-walking her team's request for data. 2 weeks later, Clara requested a meeting with him. She and Nix laid out a detailed report on his operations division. They had discovered a sophisticated low-level cyber incursion originating from a third-party logistics supplier in Southeast Asia. It wasn't stealing money, it was stealing intellectual property, slowly siphoning schematics for a next-generation processor. The breach was so subtle that the company's multi-million-dollar security suite had missed it entirely. They had been bleeding secrets for months. Caldwell stared at the report, his face draining of all color. He had been weeks away from a major product launch that a competitor would have mysteriously beaten him to. Clara hadn't just found a problem. She had saved his division from a catastrophic failure. How? He finally managed to ask, his arrogance gone, replaced by genuine awe. You look for profit and loss, Clara explained simply. My team and I, we look for patterns and weaknesses. It's just a different way of seeing the same landscape. After that day, the skepticism vanished. Caldwell became her staunchest ally. The CID was no longer Arthur's pet project. It was the company's secret weapon. The CID's first major external case came in its 5th month. A call came in from the CEO of a mid-sized Cambridge-based biotech firm called Genentech Solutions. Its founder, a brilliant but business-naive scientist named Dr. Eris Thorne, was on the verge of a breakthrough in personalized cancer therapy. His work was revolutionary, but his company was hemorrhaging money. A vulture fund, Sterling Cross, had swooped in with a seemingly generous hostile takeover bid. Dr. Thorne was panicked, fearing he would lose control of his life's work. Clara and her team took the case pro bono. As they analyzed the acquisition proposal, a chilling sense of familiarity washed over Clara. The structure wasn't the same as Julian Croft's. It was more insidious. There was no single poison pill clause. Instead, there was a complex web of phased buyouts and performance-based funding tranches designed to starve the research division of capital at a critical moment. Sterling Cross didn't want to own Genentech. They wanted to trigger a default during the acquisition process, forcing the company into bankruptcy so they could acquire its priceless portfolio of patents for pennies on the dollar in the liquidation. It was a corporate assassination, and Dr. Thorne was walking right into it. The climax was a tense 4-hour video conference. On one screen was Dr. Thorne and his small, terrified board. On the other was Clara, flanked by Maria and Samuel. She calmly and methodically dismantled the Sterling Cross offer, piece by piece. Maria presented the financial models showing the inevitable cash flow crisis. Samuel outlined the precise legal language that created the trap. Clara synthesized it all, providing Dr. Thorne with a clear, actionable counter-strategy. You need to reject the offer, she instructed, and simultaneously file for a provisional patent on your new therapeutic process. Then, issue a press release with your Phase 2 trial data and announce a new round of direct investor funding. You expose their game, protect your IP, and change the narrative, all in one move. Following her playbook to the letter, Dr. Thorne not only thwarted the takeover, but secured the funding he needed from ethical investors who were inspired by his stand. The story was picked up by Forbes, which profiled the Vance CID as the guardian angels of innovation. The day that article was published, Arthur Vance walked into Clara's office. He was holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee, just as he had on so many other mornings. Their relationship had evolved into a comfortable mentorship, a partnership of equals. He, the seasoned industrialist, provided wisdom and perspective. She, the sharp-eyed analyst, provided a new way of seeing the world he had helped build. I read the Forbes piece, he said, handing her a mug. Guardian angel. It has a nice ring to it. Clara smiled, a genuine, confident smile that reached her eyes. I prefer watchdog, she said. Angels are too quiet. They stood by the vast window, looking down at the city. It was the same view from the dining room at Aurelia, but everything was different. She was no longer on the outside looking in, a spectator to the games of powerful men. She was in the tower, a protector, a force to be reckoned with. You know, Arthur said, his voice reflective, for 50 years I thought my legacy was about what I built. The patents, the products, the stock price, tangible things. I was wrong. He turned to her, his gaze filled with a deep, abiding respect. Fighting men like Croft is a necessary evil. But what you're doing here, it's different. You're not just fighting. You're building something too. You're building a shield. You're proving that a company's strongest asset isn't its market cap, but its character. He gestured out at the sprawling metropolis. This is the real legacy, Clara. Ensuring that a few more brilliant people like Eris Thorne get a fair shot, making the sharks think twice before they bite. That's a legacy that will outlast any microchip I ever designed. Clara looked out at the endless river of traffic, the canyons of glass and steel, a world of infinite complexity, of ambition and deception. She felt no fear, no doubt. The roar of the imposter was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of purpose. The waitress who whispered a warning had found her voice, and it was a voice that now echoed in the highest echelons of power, speaking a simple but profound truth: that integrity was not for sale. Her work, the real work, was just beginning. Clara Hayes' story is a powerful reminder that the most important person in any room isn't always the one with the most power, but the one with the most courage. It's a testament to the fact that integrity is not a liability, but the ultimate asset. Arthur Vance was saved not by his lawyers or his wealth, but by his wisdom to listen to a voice of truth, no matter where it came from. Their journey shows that it's never too late to redefine your legacy, and that true strength is found in standing up for what's right, even when you're standing alone. If this story of unexpected heroism and profound justice inspired you, please help us share it. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of a single voice, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories that prove heroes are all around us. What did you think of Arthur's stunning move? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.